January 17, 1940, a bitter wind tore across the frozen plains near a small, nondescript village in northern Europe. Snow crunched under booted feet. The horizon, a gray smear of sky and frozen earth, hid both danger and death in equal measure. Soldiers hunched in ragged coats peered over the lip of a shallow trench, their breath misting in the frigid air. Somewhere beyond the hill, artillery boomed, echoing across the empty fields, shaking the ground beneath them. In the distance, armored silhouettes, tanks patched with fresh steel rolled forward, their engines grinding like metallic beasts. A radio crackled, static biting at the voices, giving fragments of orders and warnings. Men clutched rifles, bayonets glinting faintly, and waited. Fear, exhaustion, and an odd, rigid discipline held them together. Each heartbeat measured in seconds, each snowflake a reminder of isolation. No one outside these fields would remember this day. No monument would rise, no song would commemorate it. Yet here, in the cold silence and relentless wind, the fate of hundreds would be decided not by history books, but by the grind of human endurance and the cold calculus of war. And as dawn threatened to break over the frozen horizon, the first shots would ignite a battle the world almost forgot. By early 1940, Europe had already been scarred by months of war that few had anticipated would last as long as it had. The German Wehrmacht had rolled through Poland in September 1939 with frightening speed, testing blitzkrieg tactics that combined tanks, artillery, and close air support with a precision that left traditional armies scrambling. In contrast, France and Britain had mobilized, but their armies were entrenched, cautious, and ill-prepared for the mechanized fury of modern warfare. The so-called phony war had settled over the Western Front. Months passed with sporadic skirmishes and cautious reconnaissance. Soldiers dug in along the Siegfried Line and the French Maginot Line, staring across the barren fields, waiting. Winter had brought frost that hardened the soil but made movement slow and visibility cruelly stark. Snow blanketed the countryside, masking hazards and turning every step into a test of endurance. The human cost of waiting, frostbite, disease, boredom, tension was mounting quietly, unrecorded in dispatches. In this environment, small, overlooked engagements occurred. One such clash took place near a network of villages and fields that had no strategic fame. Yet the German High Command saw it as a minor advance necessary to secure supply lines and test defensive positions. Intelligence suggested a thinly held Allied line stretched over miles of frozen earth, manned by regiments pulled from both veteran and hastily trained units. The terrain favored neither side. Open fields exposed infantry to machine gun fire. Forested patches offered concealment but were laced with mines and wire. The forces involved were unevenly matched in both experience and technology. The Germans deployed Panzer Is and Is, light tanks optimized for speed and infantry support, accompanied by the Luftwaffe's dive bombers, capable of isolating positions before ground troops arrived. Artillery units were positioned with surgical precision, each shell targeted to disrupt supply routes and trench positions. Allied forces, aware of the imbalance, relied on heavier tanks like the Char B-1, slower but armored, and an assortment of anti-tank guns that were, in theory, capable of halting advances, but only if crews remained calm under fire. Commanders on both sides faced pressure from above. German officers had explicit instructions: probe, disrupt, and push the line forward without overextending. The Allies were ordered to hold, to buy time, to absorb German advances until reinforcements could arrive. Communications were fragile. Radios were prone to static, messages often delayed, and intelligence sometimes arrived hours too late. Every misstep could cascade into disaster. On the ground, soldiers understood only fragments of the bigger picture. They knew their regiment, their trench, and the frozen mud beneath their feet. They knew the whistle that would signal attack or retreat. They knew the enemy would appear over the ridge with tanks and machine guns, and that survival depended on discipline, luck, and courage. Morale varied widely. Some units carried memories of retreat from Poland. Others were green recruits, shivering under woolen coats, unsure why this place mattered. Meanwhile, technological evolution played an unspoken role. The Germans had refined the coordination of tanks and air power. Armored divisions could punch gaps in lines once considered impenetrable. The Allies had heavy artillery and fortified positions, but lacked the same speed and coordination. Logistics were critical. Ammunition, rations, and fuel had to traverse snow-choked roads under threat of reconnaissance flights. Failure in any supply chain could render superior firepower useless. Political pressures influenced the military calculus as well. In Berlin, Hitler demanded forward momentum, regardless of casualties. The High Command sought both testing and demonstration of tactical superiority, eager to justify investment in armored divisions and the Luftwaffe. In London and Paris, leaders balanced caution with a desire to defend national honor, fearing the public backlash of another disaster so soon after Poland. Orders filtered down the chain of command in vague, sometimes contradictory terms. The fog of war was both literal and figurative, a thick blanket smothering clarity. It was against this backdrop frozen plains, cautious troops, fragile communications, and the silent hum of mechanized weapons that the forgotten battle was about to ignite. Neither side would recognize the historical significance in that moment. Soldiers would only feel the cold, hear the rumble of engines, and sense the tension that preceded the first deadly exchanges. Here, human endurance, technological innovation, and leadership decisions were about to collide in ways that neither the generals nor the historians would fully appreciate. By late January 1940, the frozen fields and forests of Northern Europe had become a chessboard of anticipation. The German High Command, seeking to maintain the momentum of Blitzkrieg's psychological impact, began probing weak points along the Allied line. Reconnaissance patrols reported limited resistance in a series of small villages strung along a snow-covered road network. Though insignificant on maps, these villages formed a corridor that could allow armored units to bypass heavier fortifications, a tactical opportunity invisible to anyone outside military circles. Allied commanders, aware of the German reconnaissance but uncertain of their intentions, began shoring up defenses. Trenches were deepened, anti-tank guns repositioned, and local artillery emplacements adjusted to cover every possible approach. Morale was fragile. Letters from home brought hope but also anxiety, while soldiers readied themselves for a winter campaign unlike any they had endured. Frostbite claimed as many men as stray bullets, and the monotonous chill made each day feel endless. Yet no general would call this engagement crucial. It was merely another skirmish in a quiet sector, one destined to vanish into the annals of forgotten battles. Orders trickled down from Berlin and London alike. German officers were instructed to advance cautiously, testing enemy resolve while avoiding unnecessary casualties. Intelligence suggested a thinly held line, yet the risk of misjudgment was high. In this theater, small tactical errors could escalate quickly, especially when tanks and infantry moved in tandem. Allied units, divided between veterans and raw recruits, prepared ambush along concealed paths, relying on terrain to offset the Germans' mechanical superiority. Every frozen ditch and clump of forest became a potential advantage, or a trap. The day before the battle, reports highlighted discrepancies in Allied strength. Some units were under strength due to illness or frostbite. Others had outdated artillery shells or malfunctioning radios. German units, though disciplined and coordinated, faced the challenge of winter conditions affecting engine performance and gun accuracy. Even in minor engagements, technology could fail at critical moments. Radios misfired, tanks stalled, and artillery miscalculations were not uncommon. In such an environment, skill and improvisation were as decisive as numbers. Local topography played a silent yet decisive role. Roads were snowed over and often impassable to heavy trucks. Forested patches could conceal enemy movements but hinder counterattacks. Fields, open and unforgiving, offered no cover from artillery or aerial reconnaissance. The soldiers' understanding of the land was as vital as their weapons. Maps were incomplete or outdated, and snow erased familiar markers, turning navigation into a deadly gamble. Every misstep, every hesitation could lead to sudden death. Leadership dynamics further shaped the looming confrontation. On the German side, junior officers had leeway to exploit weak points, but any mistake could draw blame from higher command. On the Allied side, officers struggled to maintain cohesion among units split between seasoned veterans and inexperienced replacements. Orders were often delayed or misunderstood, leaving frontline troops to make rapid decisions with limited guidance. The fog of war, the literal and figurative uncertainty, hung heavily over every trench and road. By the night before the engagement, troops on both sides lay in frozen positions, aware of the coming clash yet unsure of its scale or consequence. Artillery crews checked calibrations, tank crews inspected engines, and infantrymen huddled against the cold, rifles ready, breaths misting in the air. No one could know that this clash, small and strategically minor in the grand scheme, would push men and machines to their limits. Nor could they know that their struggle, fierce and immediate, would fade from official histories, remembered only in fragments of letters, reports, and the quiet whispers of surviving soldiers. Thus the stage was set, human endurance against mechanical precision, winter against strategy, improvisation against calculated orders. A collision was imminent. The frozen plains held their breath as the first signs of movement began to stir on the horizon, a subtle, almost imperceptible prelude to a battle the world would almost forget. The men who faced the frozen fields did not know they were part of a battle history would almost forget. For them, survival was immediate, tangible, and unforgiving. Soldiers huddled in trenches, fingers numb, boots stiff with ice, listening for the faintest hum of engines across the snowy expanse. Fear was constant, but so was resolve. A single misstep could mean death, yet each man carried on, clutching rifles and bayonets, performing rituals of preparation to ward off panic, checking ammunition, adjusting coats, whispering prayers, or counting steps along the trench. Letters from home surfaced in pockets and packs, glimpses of a world far removed from the mud and metal surrounding them. Some men wrote quickly, hoping to preserve memories they might never survive. Others kept silent, understanding that words could not capture the immediacy of frostbite, the thunder of artillery, or the sudden whiplash of tank fire. Amid the chaos, camaraderie persisted. Men shared cigarettes, warm soup, and whispered encouragements. Even in a minor, forgotten battle, the bonds forged in terror and endurance were profound. Every soldier's perspective was shaped by isolation and anticipation. Night brought greater vulnerability, unseen threats, icy winds, and the knowledge that reinforcements might not arrive. Yet within the fear, acts of quiet heroism emerged. A soldier might carry a wounded comrade to cover or fire repeatedly to hold a position while others reorganized. These moments were ephemeral, disappearing with the snow, unnoticed by historians, yet they defined the human story of the engagement. The battlefield was a patchwork of frozen fields, forests, and narrow roads. Commanders on both sides had to adapt strategy to a landscape as treacherous as the enemy. German units advanced in small, coordinated groups, integrating tanks with infantry squads. Armored columns probed for gaps in the Allied lines, while reconnaissance planes scouted from above, relaying positions to commanders struggling to maintain situational awareness. Precision and timing were essential. A single delay could render a flanking maneuver ineffective. Allied troops relied on defensive advantages wherever they could. Trenches and anti-tank emplacements were positioned along predictable routes, with fields of fire carefully calculated to intercept advancing vehicles. Machine guns covered narrow lanes and choke points, while artillery could be rapidly redeployed to address sudden breakthroughs. Yet coordination remained imperfect. Communication lines were vulnerable to freezing or shell fire, and orders sometimes reached units too late to matter. Despite these challenges, tactics were fluid and adaptive. Infantry skirmishes would temporarily halt armored advances. A concealed artillery barrage could devastate approaching columns. Commanders constantly adjusted, reacting to terrain, enemy movement, and weather. In this minor, overlooked battle, the tactical decisions were a dance of improvisation, patience, and nerve small-scale maneuvers echoing the larger strategies shaping the Western Front. Technology was both a boon and a liability. German tanks, mostly Panzer IS, offered speed and coordination, but their light armor made them vulnerable to Allied anti-tank fire. Engines struggled in sub-zero temperatures and tracks slipped across ice, slowing advances and increasing exposure. Radio communication, crucial for coordinating attacks, crackled with static and sometimes failed entirely, leaving units isolated at critical moments. Allied weaponry was heavier but slower. Char-B-1 tanks and towed artillery could repel frontal attacks, yet their mobility was limited and fuel supply depended on treacherous winter roads. Infantry weapons were standard, but the cold affected mechanical reliability. Soldiers had to clear jammed rifles, warm gun barrels, and improvise solutions under fire. The battle highlighted the interplay between human skill and machinery. Tanks could dominate terrain, but only if crews maintained focus and coordination. Artillery could shape the battlefield, but only with accurate spotting and timing. Technology amplified advantage, but it also exposed vulnerability. Even minor failures could tip engagements into chaos, forcing commanders and soldiers alike to improvise in ways that left no trace in official histories. By examining these three angles, we see the forgotten battle as a convergence of human endurance, tactical improvisation, and mechanical precision. Soldiers were pushed to their limits. Commanders adapted in real time. Technology both empowered and betrayed. Together, these perspectives illuminate the intensity of a battle that history chose to overlook, yet which left an indelible mark on those who survived. Leadership in this forgotten battle was a study in pressure and improvisation. Commanders on both sides faced contradictory priorities: achieve objectives, minimize casualties, maintain discipline, and adapt to terrain and weather, all while relying on incomplete intelligence. German officers were expected to advance cautiously yet decisively, balancing orders from Berlin with the reality on frozen ground. One miscalculation, a delayed maneuver, or a misread map could stall an advance and leave troops exposed. Allied leaders, often inexperienced in winter campaigns, struggled to enforce cohesion among a mix of veterans and green recruits. Communications failures and the fog of war forced junior officers to make split-second decisions, sometimes contradicting higher command. In one trench, a platoon leader redirected his men to cover a flanking route when radio orders never arrived, buying crucial time but risking exposure elsewhere. Such decisions, small in scale, were decisive in a battle largely ignored by history. The human cost of leadership was immediate. Decisions were moral as well as tactical. Ordering a unit to hold a position under relentless tank fire could mean certain death, but failing to hold could allow a breakthrough with catastrophic consequences. Commanders carried the burden of lives in their hands, acutely aware that the battle would vanish from official records even as it defined the experience of everyone on the ground. From the German perspective, the Allies were a mixture of determination and vulnerability. Reconnaissance identified weak points, but intelligence was never complete. Soldiers observed snow-clad trenches and makeshift fortifications, uncertain if they faced veteran resistance or inexperienced recruits. Observing from the turret of a Panzer III, tank crews felt the tension of navigating icy fields where one misjudged slope or hidden anti-tank could destroy a vehicle and kill its crew instantly. The enemy was human, not an abstract force. Soldiers saw individuals peering over trenches, adjusted positions, and fired when necessary. These fleeting observations shaped immediate tactics. A suppressed machine gun nest, a concealed mortar, or a suddenly exposed line of infantry could dictate the next maneuver. Even in a minor engagement, the psychological awareness of the adversary anticipating reactions, gauging morale was critical. Soldiers were constantly balancing aggression with caution, aware that misreading an opponent's intent could have deadly consequences. This enemy perspective mirrors the Allies' own experience: uncertainty, fear, and reliance on both improvisation and protocol. Both sides were participants in a silent dialogue of movement, observation, and reaction, each unaware of the historical anonymity their struggle would ultimately face. The moral and psychological dimensions of this battle were as unforgiving as the terrain. Soldiers confronted more than bullets and tanks. They faced ethical and existential questions rarely recorded in official histories. Should they risk exposing themselves to protect a comrade? Could hesitation or insubordination be justified under lethal conditions? Each choice carried weight, and every decision was amplified by the relentless environment, cold, fatigue, and the omnipresent threat of death. Psychologically, the battle was a crucible. Men endured endless waiting punctuated by sudden violence. The snow masked the battlefield, hiding bodies and explosions alike, amplifying disorientation and fear. Units relied on ritual, discipline, and shared trust to survive. Soldiers spoke quietly of home, clutched letters, or memorized prayers, grounding themselves amid chaos. Yet the knowledge that this engagement was officially minor added a peculiar dimension. They were fighting, dying, and surviving in a conflict that no one would formally acknowledge. Morale swung like a pendulum. A successful ambush could lift spirits for hours. The sudden loss of a tank or a comrade could crush it just as quickly. Fear was ever present, but so too was determination. Human endurance, psychological resilience, and ethical judgment shaped the battle as much as artillery, rifles, or armored divisions. Through these angles, leadership, enemy, and moral, psychological, the forgotten battle emerges not as a footnote, but as a living, breathing human experience. Decisions, reactions, and endurance all intertwined, amplified by technology, terrain, and uncertainty. Though history largely ignored it, the intensity of this confrontation left an indelible mark on those who survived, setting the stage for the decisive moment that would follow. Dawn broke on January 18, 1940, with a gray, overcast sky that barely lightened the frozen plains. The wind had eased slightly, but the frost still clung to every coat, helmet, and rifle. From the German lines, the low rumble of tanks began a muted, metallic growl that grew steadily louder. Infantrymen moved alongside armored columns, rifles at the ready, scanning for the slightest movement in the whitewashed landscape. Recon planes circled above, silhouettes against the clouds, sending brief radio bursts that crackled across frozen wires. At the first light, the quiet shattered. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed Allied positions, ripping through the air with sudden, violent intensity. Panzer IIs and IIs surged forward, their tracks grinding against snow-packed earth. A single tank struck a hidden anti-tank mine, its explosion sending a cloud of debris skyward and killing 2 crewmen instantly. Nearby, a platoon of infantry froze, pinned by overlapping fields of fire. The battlefield, so meticulously studied in maps and orders, became chaotic, unpredictable, alive with danger. Commanders on both sides reacted instantly. On the German side, a junior officer signaled a flanking maneuver, attempting to circumvent the trench line. His voice was swallowed by wind and gunfire, but hand signals directed advancing squads. Meanwhile, Allied leaders moved along the trench line, shouting terse commands to reposition machine guns, adjust artillery fire, and cover gaps exposed by the first assault. Decisions that had seemed minor in planning became matters of life and death. The first hour of fighting set the tone. Tank columns moved cautiously through snow-choked paths, vulnerable to mines and concealed anti-tank crews. Infantry squads dashed between low ridges and patches of forest, dodging artillery fragments and strafing from above. Soldiers shouted warnings and encouragements, adrenaline sharpening senses even as fatigue gnawed at muscles and frostbitten fingers. Each engagement was a microcosm of chaos. A few men might hold a trench, then retreat under overwhelming fire. A single artillery strike could disrupt coordination across the line. Technology shaped the opening moves decisively. German tanks, fast but lightly armored, relied on coordination with infantry and artillery spotting. One tank commander, observing a blocked road, ordered a detour through an open field. Within seconds, it was struck by a concealed 37mm anti-tank gun. The vehicle skidded, smoke rising from its engine compartment, and the crew scrambled under fire. Nearby infantry moved to suppress the gunners, improvising cover from snowbanks and fallen trees. Each interaction of man, machine, and terrain was a delicate calculation under deadly conditions. The human cost became visible almost immediately. Frostbitten men collapsed under fire, tripped by the uneven ground, or fell from exhaustion while dragging comrades to cover. Shouts of pain mingled with the whistle of incoming shells. Soldiers pressed on, motivated by fear, loyalty, and survival instinct. Even small successes of machine gun nests silenced. A trench held for 10 extra minutes were celebrated quietly, unnoticed by anyone beyond the battlefield. By mid-morning, the lines had shifted subtly but irrevocably. German units probing the left flank forced Allied infantry to abandon a forward trench, leaving gaps in the defensive web. Commanders on both sides realized that winter, terrain, and mechanical failures were shaping the engagement as much as strategy. Tanks stalled in icy mud, rifles jammed, radios failed. Every misstep cascaded through the units, amplifying the danger for those on the front lines. Throughout the chaos, leadership decisions were tested. Junior officers assumed responsibilities usually reserved for higher command, directing platoons with split-second judgment. On one side, a sudden retreat threatened to unravel a sector, but a sergeant rallied his men, holding a narrow passage long enough for reinforcements to arrive. On the other, a tank commander abandoned a stalled vehicle under fire, directing his remaining crew to return to cover while providing suppressive fire for advancing infantry. Every choice mattered, every reaction was magnified by the unforgiving environment. As noon approached, the frozen plains were no longer silent expanses of white. Smoke, snow, and scattered debris marked the landscape. The first decisive movements had been made, but the battle was far from over. Both sides had tested each other, revealing strengths, weaknesses, and limits. Soldiers and machines had collided under extreme conditions, and the outcome remained uncertain. The stage was set for the true turning point, a moment when a single maneuver, a single breakthrough, or a single failure would decide the fate of units and individuals alike. The frozen battlefield held its breath, waiting for the clash that would define this forgotten engagement. By mid-afternoon, the battle had escalated into a full-scale, chaotic engagement. Trenches and snowdrifts were scarred by artillery fire, leaving shattered earth and frozen debris as silent witnesses to the violence. German armored units, having absorbed initial losses, regrouped for a coordinated push along the central corridor. Tanks moved in tighter formations, supported by infantry squads who darted between cover, laying suppressive fire and clearing obstacles. A critical moment came when a German Panzer III, navigating a narrow, snow-choked lane, drew fire from a concealed Allied anti-tank gun. The shell struck the side armor, igniting fuel and ammunition. The vehicle lurched violently, and crew members scrambled into the snow under a hail of rifle bullets. Nearby infantry surged forward, both to rescue comrades and maintain pressure on the enemy line. This brief, chaotic exchange became a pivot point. The Germans learned the terrain's limits, and the Allies recognized both the vulnerability and the resilience of the armored advance. Elsewhere, a contingent of Allied troops attempted a counterattack across an open field, hoping to flank the advancing Germans. Snow crunched under boots as men moved in tense silence, rifles ready. Suddenly, artillery from a German forward observer rained shells on the advancing line. Soldiers fell, some killed instantly, others wounded and frozen in place. The attack stalled, morale faltered, and the counterattack became a defensive withdrawal under fire. Every decision was immediate, every misstep magnified by winter and the relentless pressure of the enemy. Leadership decisions continued to shape the battlefield. A young German lieutenant, observing a vulnerable ridge held by the Allies, ordered a concentrated flanking maneuver. Tanks and infantry converged in a coordinated push, exploiting gaps in trench lines created earlier in the morning. Simultaneously, Allied officers struggled to maintain cohesion amid fragmented communications and mounting casualties. Orders issued over frozen radios were often delayed or misinterpreted. In one sector, a platoon commander redirected his men to cover a collapsing flank, preventing a breakthrough but at the cost of exposing another trench. The human dimension of the climax was stark. Soldiers endured exhaustion, frostbite, and fear, yet continued to fight with grim determination. Men carried wounded comrades to makeshift shelters, improvised cover from snowbanks, and fired until ammunition ran low. Acts of courage and desperation unfolded simultaneously across the battlefield. A rifleman holding a trench alone against advancing infantry, a tank crew improvising repairs under enemy fire, a medic braving machine gun fire to rescue the wounded. These actions were fleeting, ephemeral, and ultimately invisible to history. Yet they defined the intensity of the engagement. Technology, as in the opening hours, proved both decisive and fallible. German tanks, while fast and coordinated, struggled in icy terrain. Engines stalled, tracks slipped, and mechanical failures left crews stranded under fire. Allied artillery was effective but limited by frozen ground and obstructed sightlines. Communications faltered. Radios crackled with static and orders were often delayed. Every mechanical element interacted with human decision-making, creating unpredictable consequences. A single misfire, a stalled vehicle, or an exhausted crew could determine life or death within seconds. The turning point came in the late afternoon. A coordinated German assault on a key ridge succeeded after sustained infantry and tank pressure. The Allies, depleted and disoriented, were forced to abandon forward positions, creating a breach in the defensive line. German officers capitalized immediately, sending reinforcements through the gap to consolidate control. This maneuver shifted momentum decisively. Units that had struggled to advance now pushed the front line forward, while retreating Allied forces scrambled to reorganize behind secondary positions. Casualties mounted rapidly. By evening, the snow was streaked with blood and blackened by smoke. Estimates indicate that several hundred soldiers were killed or wounded on both sides in a matter of hours, a substantial toll given the small scale of the engagement. Survivors described exhaustion, disbelief, and a sense of surreal detachment. The battle was overwhelming in immediacy, yet at the time seemed peripheral in the larger war. As night fell, the battlefield fell into uneasy silence. Both sides regrouped, reassessing losses, positions, and capabilities. The decisive German push had altered the local tactical situation, yet the broader strategic impact remained minimal. The frozen landscape, scarred and silent once more, bore the traces of intense human struggle, shattered vehicles, collapsed trenches, and the silent forms of soldiers who would never return home. The turning point had arrived not through a grand strategy or historic maneuver, but through the convergence of human endurance, leadership, tactical improvisation, and the limits of technology. Every choice improvised or calculated had been magnified by the harsh winter and the immediacy of danger. The battle, though largely unrecognized in official histories, had tested men and machines alike, leaving indelible marks on those who survived. The next chapter would reveal the aftermath, the human, material, and psychological consequences of a battle that history almost forgot. The morning after the engagement, the frozen plains were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Snow, previously pristine, was now pockmarked with shell craters, tank tracks, and footprints that led nowhere. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and smoke, lingering even after the artillery had fallen silent. Soldiers on both sides emerged cautiously from trenches and cover, faces gaunt, hands stiff from cold, eyes searching for survivors or the enemy among the ruins of a battlefield few outside the sector would ever know existed. Casualty reports painted a grim picture. The Allies lost an estimated 300 men, including infantry and artillery crews, with dozens more wounded and frostbitten. German losses were comparable, with at least 250 killed or incapacitated by gunfire, artillery, and mechanical failures. Tanks had been destroyed or immobilized. Panzer E's and I's lay twisted in the snow, some burnt, some abandoned after engines froze or tracks snapped. Allied Char B-1 South suffered heavy damage, their crews forced to flee under withering fire. In both cases, the toll was compounded by the cold. Frostbite claimed more than a few men who might otherwise have survived minor injuries, and exposure forced rapid improvisation of shelters and warmth. Material destruction was extensive relative to the scale of the engagement. Trenches and forward positions were shattered, artillery emplacements wrecked, and roads rendered impassable by debris and craters. Supply lines had been disrupted on both sides, leaving scattered units short of ammunition, food, and medical care. Communication equipment, radios, field telephones, and signal devices had been damaged or frozen, further complicating coordination. Even temporary fortifications would take days to rebuild, assuming the units could hold the area. The psychological impact was immediate. Survivors described a pervasive exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, a mental numbness created by the intensity and anonymity of the fight. Soldiers who had crawled through snow to carry wounded comrades, who had fired on enemy positions while bullets whipped past their faces, felt a mix of relief and disbelief that they had survived. Yet there was no public recognition, no parades, no medals. For the soldiers, the battle was real and consequential. For the world, it would remain invisible. Reports filed by commanding officers reflected the struggle to reconcile tactical outcomes with broader strategic considerations. The Germans noted the breach achieved along the ridge, praising small unit coordination and ingenuity in navigating icy terrain. They acknowledged mechanical failures, emphasizing the importance of winter readiness and the resilience of the infantry. Allied reports, meanwhile, highlighted unexpected gaps in the line, commendable defensive actions under duress, and the need for better winter preparation. Both sets of reports were meticulous yet impersonal, listing numbers and movements while leaving the human stories buried in footnotes or lost altogether. Morale shifted subtly in the immediate aftermath. The Allies were forced to consolidate behind secondary lines, aware that German forces now held a minor but tactically significant advantage. Soldiers endured the bitter cold and the uncertainty of whether another engagement would follow, carrying memories of fallen comrades and destroyed equipment. German troops, despite casualties, gained confidence in their ability to coordinate armor, infantry, and artillery in difficult conditions. Yet officers on both sides recognized the precariousness of winter warfare. One miscalculation or failed communication could reverse the fragile gains of the day. Amid the physical and psychological consequences, the battle began to fade from contemporary memory almost instantly. Newspapers, focused on larger campaigns and public morale, made no mention. High command records filed the engagement as a minor skirmish, necessary but not strategically pivotal. Soldiers wrote letters home describing only fragments, often omitting the horror and intensity for fear of alarming family or simply because the events defied easy explanation. In essence, the battle existed fully in the experiences of those who survived it, and nowhere else. The stage was set for the long-term consequences, how these fleeting, intense hours would influence strategy, morale, and perception of winter warfare, and why this engagement would remain nearly invisible to historians. In the weeks that followed, the frozen fields of the forgotten battle slowly returned to their quiet, desolate state. Trenches were repaired, supply lines patched, and artillery repositioned. But the human imprint of the engagement lingered far longer than any physical damage. Soldiers carried invisible scars, frostbite that never fully healed, lingering aches from exhaustion, and the memory of comrades lost to both gunfire and the indifferent cold. These wounds shaped morale in ways that official reports could not capture. For the Allied forces, the retreat and the breach along the ridge became a lesson in winter preparedness and small unit coordination. Commanders reassessed defensive deployments, emphasizing flexibility and rapid response in minor engagements. Despite these adjustments, morale remained fragile. Men questioned the strategic significance of sacrifices made in snow-choked fields, where the battle itself would likely vanish from official histories. Yet within these units, the bonds forged under fire through shared endurance, improvisation, and quiet acts of heroism remained profoundly influential, sustaining cohesion in later, more prominent campaigns. German commanders, meanwhile, gained confidence in the reliability of combined arms operations under extreme conditions. Lessons were absorbed regarding coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery, as well as the limitations imposed by winter terrain. Yet the human cost was clear. Even a minor engagement produced casualties that could not be ignored. Officers noted the need for contingency planning, for maintaining morale, and for constant adaptation when mechanical failure, weather, and human endurance intersected. These lessons, though critical, would largely remain unpublished, absorbed into internal training and tactical manuals rather than celebrated or recorded publicly. The psychological and moral dimensions of the engagement persisted. Soldiers wrestled with the sense of futility that accompanies forgotten battles. Men who had fought fiercely, saving comrades, improvising under fire, and enduring unimaginable conditions, realized that their struggle would go unnoticed. Letters home, often sanitized or vague, conveyed little of the intensity, while commanding officers' reports reduced heroism and suffering to numbers, positions, and objectives achieved. The dissonance between lived experience and historical record created a subtle, persistent tension among survivors, one that lingered long after the guns fell silent. Historians examining winter campaigns would later note the engagement only in passing, if at all. It lacked the scale of Dunkirk, the drama of the Battle of France, or the notoriety of other clashes on the Western Front. Yet for those present, the battle tested every element of warfare: endurance, improvisation, tactical coordination, leadership, and technological reliability. Its significance was not measured in strategic victories or territorial gains, but in the crucible of human and mechanical limits pushed to extremes under the unforgiving winter sky. The anonymity of the battle also influenced perception of the Western Front in early 1940. Political leaders and high command could dismiss localized failures or successes without scrutiny. Units were shuffled, reinforcements rerouted, and strategies adjusted based on lessons absorbed quietly and silently. Soldiers, in turn, internalized the realities of war as both unpredictable and unrecognized, a lesson in endurance that would carry them into later, more decisive operations. Even decades later, accounts from veterans reveal the lasting imprint. Recollections are vivid: the metallic rumble of tanks, the sharp crack of artillery, the bitter cold, and the faces of comrades frozen in snow or staring down machine gun fire. Yet these narratives remain fragmented, personal, and largely absent from public discourse. The battle endured in memory alone, a testament to the intensity of human experience divorced from recognition or record. By the end of January 1940, the frozen plains had returned to silence. Strategically, the engagement changed little. Politically, it was invisible. But the human, technological, and tactical lessons it produced would echo through subsequent winter campaigns, informing both Allied and German approaches. And most importantly, it left a generation of soldiers acutely aware of the cost of war, the fragility of survival, and the peculiar reality of fighting fiercely for a cause history would barely notice. The battlefield, scarred and silent, became a monument of memory without inscription, a reminder that even the smallest engagements can test courage, ingenuity, and endurance. And from this quiet aftermath, the philosophical reflection emerges: why some battles are remembered and why others, no less significant to those who live them, vanish into the cold mists of history. The frozen plains, now quiet and still, hold no plaques or memorials. The snow, once streaked with blood and scarred by metal, has reclaimed its surface, erasing footprints, shell craters, and the traces of human struggle. Yet beneath the silence lies the story of men and machines tested to their limits, of courage and endurance recorded only in memory. This is the paradox of forgotten battles. Their importance is immediate, intimate, and immense, but their recognition is denied by history itself. Here, we confront the fragile balance of human endeavor and mechanical power. Soldiers faced the cold, exhaustion, and enemy fire with nothing but discipline and instinct. Tanks advanced, engines groaned, and artillery fired with deadly precision, but technology alone could not decide the outcome. It was human ingenuity, split-second decision-making, and perseverance that shaped the engagement. Even the smallest axe dragging a wounded comrade, holding a trench against impossible odds, improvising under failure, became decisive in ways no report could capture. The battle also reminds us of the selective memory of history. Some engagements are immortalized in monuments, films, and textbooks. Others vanish, leaving only fragments in letters, diaries, and whispered recollections. Yet significance is not measured by fame or recognition. The endurance, leadership, and sacrifice demonstrated here would echo in later campaigns, quietly shaping tactics, morale, and the understanding of winter warfare. Ultimately, the frozen plains stand as both witness and teacher. They show that courage is not always celebrated, and struggle is not always recorded. Battles may be forgotten by the world, but they endure in the hearts, memories, and experiences of those who live them. The cold, silent landscape reminds us that history is not only written in victories and defeats, but in survival, in the quiet heroism of ordinary men, and in the unrecorded moments that define the human experience in war. And as the wind drifts across the snow, whispering through the scars of trenches and the remnants of machinery, one realizes that remembrance is not always public, but it is never entirely lost.